Also, the paper, or it's actually not as coherent as a paper. It's a series of reflections, and I really, I'm trying to work out answers to questions. So I have more questions than I have conclusions at this moment. But a lot of what I'm thinking about comes from not only my experience as a researcher, as an academic working on questions of of Islam, race, and Black Lives Matter in the current moment. But also, I come to these questions as somebody with many years as an activist organizer and somebody who's worked on the ground in community for a decade at least before I came to graduate school, right? And so thinking about the pragmatics of what it means to be a Muslim political citizen, right? And what are the areas of concern, right, that are legitimately identified as Muslim? Part of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to go into a little bit of history, at least in terms of recent years, in terms of Muslim political engagement, to think about where that places us and where we are now, how far we've come from that. So it's really, it may seem a little bit incoherent, I hope not, but I'm still really trying to work out what the relationships are between kind of my questions and the observations that I'm making as an ethnographer, and still somebody who does activist work. I don't know, on the side as a moonlighter. I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. But this is kind of where I am. Okay, and so to talk about the title for a hot second, it might be odd, I guess, maybe to think about framing a talk about Muslim political engagement with a quote from the New Testament, but bear with me here, right? I grew up in a Christian environment, so I carry a lot of that with me in terms of how I think about the world. But it seemed a fitting framing device in which to place these reflections, thinking about Proverbs 24, 3 and 4, by wisdom a house is built, and through understanding it is established. Through knowledge its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures. Thinking about the ways that something that we might call a Muslim political platform might be built, right? And I think that the talks that were given by Junaid and Sylvia in some ways complement this really nicely, because some of the questions that I'm interested in, I think, are similar and the same, and their presentations actually fill in some of the gaps. So it's kind of nice that I came here. So think of knowledge. So I think of wisdom as the Merriam-Webster definition, right, was knowledge of what is true and right, coupled with just judgment as to action, sagacity, discernment, and insight, right? So thinking about wisdom as a holistic way of thinking about what Muslim politics might entail. Because I think for me, part of it's a frustration, actually. Part of it is a simple frustration, not just because Muslims are constantly responding to discourse, flattening and essentializing discourses about who we are and what we're supposed to care about. So our areas of concern are to jihad or not to jihad, or or hijab, or also there's a sense in which we, and when I'm saying we here, I'm thinking about just the generalized public discourse around Islam and Muslims, is that there's this sense that there's a sexuality and sexual politics that is being policed from a Muslim perspective, or at least this is what Muslims are interested in. Muslims want to impose some type of Puritan, sexual morality upon the public. And this is what we're obsessed about, right? When I think that most of us are concerned about whether or not we're going to be able to provide adequate health care for ourselves and for our families. Where are our children going to go to school? Can I move about in the world without being brutalized by agents of the state? These are questions that people are considering, and so our politics and our political discourse, I think, need to be more reflective of that. Okay, so this is part of what all of this hand-wringing and agonizing over what it means to what a Muslim political platform might contain, what that might look like, what it is that we could possibly do as political subjects. That's where a lot of that is coming from. Okay. And so, of course, an interesting place to start are the 2016 elections, right? Where Muslims certainly have shown up as objects in American politics and political discourse before. I think in the 2016 election, Muslims show up in a way that's, that's more vigorous, right, than any moment in history up to this point. We are, and this is, of course, a defining moment from the most recent presidential election cycle during the Democratic National Convention, where Khizr Khan and his wife Ghazala, who are the parents of an army captain who was killed in service, are on stage talking about their son, talking about his life, talking about his sacrifice. And this is the moment where Khizr Khan is speaking directly to Donald Trump, right? And his Islamophobic rhetoric and his talk of a Muslim ban and all of these things that have happened up to this point in the election, with his copy of the Constitution that he's holding in his hand, basically as a foil, to talk about, to stake a claim, right, to, Muslim belonging and, and claims to American citizenship. And so this is an interesting moment. And so, however, I mean, there's a lot going on here for me. I think that on the one hand, it was very heart wrenching, right, to hear these parents talk, who have lost their son, who have paid the ultimate price in service of their country, have to basically beg for basic recognition of their citizenship and humanity, right, from the state. And so that's an interesting kind of, it's heart-wrenching for more than one reason, right? But then there's also this sense in which, where a lot of people found that this might, at least in the moment, they thought it might be an effective foil against, kind of the constant onslaught of not just Donald Trump, but at that point the whole Republican field of candidates who had come and been eliminated by this point in the campaign. There's a sense in which I watched this, and without kind of denigrating their sacrifice, and with all due respect to what they have endured and given, it's just like, is this all we are, right? Is this the only type of way the public can imagine a Muslim, right? Like in relationship to the state, right? Either you have to either be a threat to the state, an existential threat to the state, or you have to sacrifice everything in service of it to prove that you're not the former. Right? And so is there room for a middle ground? Is there room for nuance? Is there room for complexity in how we show up and how we articulate what it is that we need to be doing as Muslim political subjects, right? Okay, so part of these questions also for me are as a result of my own background. As a convert to Islam, I accepted Islam in 1989 and 89 and 90, around that time, and I was influenced and brought into the fold largely by the politics of conscious hip hop. I was listening to Rakim, I was listening to Public Enemy, I was listening to Boogie Down Productions, who although didn't identify as Muslim per se, right? But there was a lot of, there's a lot of fertile ground where Islam is a political, framework, right? It's not just about, I pray or God or this or that, but it's also connected to a holistic program of social justice. This is what captured my imagination in the first place, right? And so for me, there's a totalizing and not totalizing in the same way that we typically talk about an Islamic fusion of spirituality and politics, but there's a way in which there's a holistic framework that I tend to think through, like that my spirituality is connected to social justice, it's connected to economic justice, it's connected to racial justice, it's connected to ensuring that the vulnerable are protected. at a fundamental, basic, existential level. And so I'm trying to understand, how do we recapture that? How do we bring that back into our political discourse? Okay, so going back, this chronology is kind of all over the place, but work with me here. This is an image. When I was thinking about a possible, to kind of blatantly rob Junaid's framework here, but thinking about a possible genealogy, right? Where does this come from? How do I show up in 1989 as a teenager? And there's already some sort of framework through which I can understand, spirituality and politics as expressed in music, right? Where the first place I actually hear Malcolm X's voice is over a hip hop beat, right? How does that happen, right? And so, of course, this brings me back to early Black Muslim communities and the ways in which, again, there's a sense in which Islam was. I guess I'm sort of trying to resist these easy categorizations of religion, politics, as things that are like oil and water and they don't mix, right? There's a sense in which there is a spiritually based political paradigm with which we think about and understand our condition. We understand why our neighborhoods look the way they do. We understand why we're experiencing poverty and injustice and imbalance. So this is the Nation of Islam's flag. Okay, and it's significant to me because it visualizes this in a really interesting way. So in the middle, of course, there's a star and crescent. It's turned the other way, which is significant in the way that it orients, right, the center of Islam to the West or to the United States, right? Because this is fundamentally a U.S. based, and the history in which it emerges from is as a central part of the theology of the Nation of Islam. Actually, theologically, that racism and white supremacy and slavery factor into the theology and cosmology of the movement, right? So it's not just it's over here. It's actually a part of the way in which they imagine the world to have been created and sustained and whatever. So anyhow, so that's the star and crescent. But then the letters on each of the corners stand for freedom, justice, equality, and Islam, right? And it's interesting to me that these things they're kind of equivalent balancing posts, right? They all go together. Like Islam is an anchor, freedom is an anchor, justice is an anchor, equality is an anchor, right? And so these things are not, right? The ways in which we think about what it means to be a Muslim spiritual political subject, right, is kind of holistic in that way. And so how do we get from here to a place like this, where in the 2000 election, this was a really interesting thing to experience for me as an African American Muslim. I remember at the time that I was hearing a lot of chatter in the Muslim circles that I frequented in the mosques and whatnot about this Muslim, American Muslim, right, endorsement of George W. Bush's candidacy. And I remember like thinking at the time, like, this is insane. Like, what? Like, on what planet does this make any sense whatsoever? But it made sense. I think when I looked at it, when I thought about it years later and reflecting over it, I think on a fundamental level, it represents a really interesting racial divide. I think even at the time, most African American Muslims I knew, and wasn't doing formal research at that time, but anecdotally I can say that it was a very neat racial divide. I mean, it was pretty much like if you were an African American Muslim, you're like, what? No. Like, just no. But many of the immigrant descendant communities, right, were behind this candidacy, and it's a significant moment because it is the first time in American political life that Muslims, American Muslims, kind of enter the presidential electoral politics as a bloc, right? It is significant for that, regardless of what we think about, what I might think about the conclusions that were drawn. It's an interesting moment in which the Muslim political bloc and the beginnings of what we might call, or the re-beginnings, or the second iteration, I don't know what we want to call it, of an American Muslim political voice start to emerge, right? So of course this happens, right? This is largely based on, in terms of CARE exit polls, this is largely based upon an idea that a lot of Muslims kind of lined up with the GOP because they represented family values, which generally means a particular type of respectable sexual politics, to the exclusion of actual policies that support families, that enable them to sustain themselves and stay together, and these types of things, right? So there's an attention to kind of the sexual practices in terms of traditional nuclear families, but we're talking about eradicating food stamps and closing schools and, right, all of these different things that actually kind of work detrimental to actual family existence. So, but be that as it may, this is what happened in that moment, right? And of course, 9/11 happens, and everything begins to be reevaluated. And so, Muslim political engagement. I have a few minutes left, so I just need to speed up a little bit. But then, kind of this public Muslim civic life, right, begins to evolve at this point. I think after 9/11 and the things that sort of happen afterwards, right, with Muslim immigrants being detained, right, with all of these, really interesting things that begin to happen that, I don't know, in the current political moment don't necessarily seem like they were all that bad, like just with nostalgia. Maybe it wasn't that bad back then. I don't know. But at the time, it was pretty intense, and it was pretty serious. So I think so there's been a slow shift, right? People have begun to kind of reevaluate, how it might look if we get involved, where we need to be, how do we develop lobbying and media strategies in order to articulate what our list of concerns or whatever. But I think we still have a long way to go. And so that's the end of the slides. But I want to also, just before I close, I want to talk about something that I participated in this most recent political campaign that brought me back to thinking about all of this in a real systematic way. I was asked by a couple of colleagues during the primary season to pen an op-ed to kind of construct what might be an endorsement. It was an endorsement of Bernie Sanders' candidacy at the time, but what we wanted to do was to really to kind of speak against that moment where it was just kind of like, oh, well, George Bush represents family values, or George Bush said something that might be considered favorable to Israel, but actually construct there were maybe four of us. It was myself, there was an Egyptian American, there was a Pakistani American, and we're all, so we really tried to actually come together as a diverse collective of Muslim intellectuals to actually think about a range of concerns that was impacting Muslim communities. We talked about, so we looked at the candidates in terms of their education policy, in terms of their healthcare policy, in terms of their engagement with Black Lives Matter and issues of state violence, in terms of foreign policy, so we really tried to think about a more comprehensive way of thinking about the whole Muslim person, right? Not just as somebody who might be the recipient of, kind of essentialized Islamophobic and racist projections, but actually an active, engaged, holistic, ethical, spiritual, and political citizen, right? And so that's where we are. So it's really, thank you for indulging and allowing me to kind of talk through these reflections, because it's a work in progress for me, and your feedback is most appreciated. Thank you.